I feel like there are a lot of fundamentals that are shifting back to like how things used to be, in the sense that impact is more front and center versus like flashy features. There's a concept that you talk about in your thesis, which I thought was really interesting, around everboarding, meaning the relationship between the software provider and the customer being a little bit more relational than even it used to be. So I'm curious about you kind of elaborating on that. And what does it look like? Describe it, and then what does it look like how if it's done well? Because I know we have
Yeah,
this fear of like having like account folks always be constantly attached to customers as well.
it's interesting. These are two organizations and software companies that are often seen as, I guess I have to invest there. And for those people who have tried to sell into these functions, they're doing God's work, but they never have power to buy anything,
Yeah.
right? And so there's onboarding, there's everboarding, there's waterboarding. I'll talk about onboarding versus everboarding.
Yeah.
Sales onboarding is a very interesting thing. I remember when I joined Salesforce.com, I was getting sued by Tom Siebel because he liked to sue people. Um, and we'd hired like 30 reps over the year, and they'd never been trained. And Mark
Yeah.
was like, "Hey, can you think you can train these people? Because we got to go kick Siebel's ass." And I was like, "Have we ever done training here?" No. So I put together like a 1 week boot camp with a certification and case study. And if you didn't pass the certification, you were fired. Like it was,
Yeah.
you know. But the funny thing is, when we think about sales onboarding, we focus on the first 60 to 90 days of a sales hire. We got to get them the ramped. We got to get competent running our playbook, know exactly what to say or do at each stage of the sales process. But what's interesting is if your product by the end of that first year is 2 to 3 times more different or more valuable than of their tenure than it was the knowledge you shared in the first 30 to 60 days, what then?
Hmm.
Right. And so when I talk to AI founders, you know, I ask them, how much do you think your sales approach, especially relates to your messaging, your discovering, your value or capability? In my messaging tree, what does your product, what job to be done does your product do for your buyer that
Hmm.
they really shit about, that they want to solve now better than somebody else? Right? If you can nail that, that's the basics of product marketing and sales messaging.
Yeah.
How much do you think that's going to change over the next 12 months? And they look at me like, well, a ton. And then I'm like, well, then what are you doing to make sure
Yeah.
that your team is on board? And then
Yeah.
similarly, customer onboarding, another often seen as a
Yeah.
junior function. I always thought it was silly in a SaaS world where products were always customizable, released a lot of features, et cetera, that we thought about onboarding, like, let's get them live.
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, we'll get some success person, the function that we underinvest in, and somehow they're going to magically make the customer take advantage of all the ongoing stuff.
Yeah.
It was always silly. Now, if you deploy a product and your product becomes 2 to 3 times more capable over a year, then what? How do you think about um, that person or that using that product, discovering that capability, et cetera? Because you and I talked about this, like there's an R in AR. Well, we'll talk about annual in a second, but
Yeah.
ARR is annual recurring revenue. We look at churn and NRR, et cetera. But like if you have an employee, you should have people would evaluate, I'm using this agentic product, or I could hire an
Yeah.
employee. And I'd be like, how much growth has this employee shown over the year? How much potential do they have vis-a-vis other people? And I think they'll think that same way around products. And so how do you think through this? The other thing which is really interesting is I remember I'm a crazy zero inbox guy. And I remember I was like the seventh customer Superhuman, and
Yeah.
Rahul onboarded me, the founder of Superhuman. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. This seems like a
Yeah.
waste. I was like, how can this be efficient? And what Rahul got, and it wasn't AI yet,
Hmm.
was this was a personal thing to me about a
Hmm.
habit of how I like to manage my email. And if he could get me into that habit, then I was hooked. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing with AI. Like I have organizations that are thinking of that have hired really expensive people from onboarding. Like somebody hired somebody from Apple who was responsible for designing that package or box that you get from Apple products. It's still really cool, even though you just get the same phone. It's just like the last phone, but has a better battery. But with that
Yeah.
box, and when you open that, and the tape open, it's that little magic moment. I think it's the same way we have to rethink onboarding for these agentic products because while you might be selling to an organization, these are very personal products. I am helping
Yeah.
you as an individual do this work. And either out of the gate, they go, oh, holy hell yeah. Right. I think you and I were talking about, I remember my wife, she went to the Kennedy School. She's a preeminent expert on charter schools and affordable housing and the rest of it.
Yeah.
Amazing writer. And she spends a lot of time sort of the shadow government here where I live, surfacing all state data and analysis, and then putting stuff together, presenting at city council and to state representatives. And I remember the first time I showed her ChatGPT, she was kind of like, oh, this is pretty interesting. And then when I moved to Claude, and she had a project where it remembered her voice and started writing.
Mhm.
And then I showed her deep research. She's hook, line, and sinker, right? But like there are these moments of delight. And so I think onboarding is something we have to really think about and get right. So that's how I think about everboarding versus sort of this point in time, whether it's your salespeople, with your customers.
I think it appears that you need to stay more like top of mind for your customers in terms of like relevance, and like the minute they forget about a tool or forget about you, it's a lot of folks that just tend to move on to the next fancy thing that's coming out, right? Which brings me to my
people are really busy, right?
People are really busy. People are excited to try all sorts of tools right now. So it's there's a lot of enthusiasm around like, I'm going to try everything. But the thing that sticks generally ends up being the thing that is like top of mind for them in terms of relation, messaging, all of that. Yeah, would you agree?